Hi, and welcome. Um, you need to unmute. There you are. Welcome, Billy. I will talk a little bit just to so that we can have a transition here and give you some moments to settle on screen. Um, I know that I've been I've been experiencing the relative lack of privilege of being at a conference that isn't in English. And although the translations are excellent, just dealing with that interface is quite a lot to take in. Um, Before I introduce you, Billy, I would like to say to all of our delegates, but particularly those whose principal language is English, that we really invite your participation. Um, no question there's no stupid question. I'd be interested in hearing where you are, what you're experiencing throughout the conference as you listen to our speakers. Um, Including experiences of difference or dissonance from what's being presented. And I will do my best, as will my colleagues, to feed back to the presenters' comments that you make in the chat. So welcome, Billy. It feels a little unusual for me to be hosting you within a space because for so much of my Gestalt career, right from when you were my first supervisor, um, and I'm also thinking of the many moments that you've hosted me as part of the GSRD group of the IAGT. Um, I've really appreciated your support. Um, Billy, you are somebody who always stands out for me as a person who doesn't shy from speaking up around the rights of queer people, also around in the interests of social justice more generally, and for the voices of those who for whom there is less space. And I also appreciate, and I'm minded of this now, is that when I work with you, I also feel the invitation to be in my body, almost as like the grounding place for connecting from a place that is mindful of social justice as an ethical starting point. I know you've recently flown back from Kenya, so we're all very grateful to have you here today. Um, and thank you for making the time and the commitment to be with us. Um, so I will hand over to you, Billy, and we are here. I'm here to offer any support you might need whilst you give your presentation. Yes.
May evoke around the experience of migration and exiling. And that's my intent. As I start a new technology, I feel apprehensive on each time I step into this space. Even though I'm an older man, I've been doing this for a long time, I still feel the unveiling of my experience and those, most importantly, of my clients over almost going on 30 years, that I have a desire to honor the suffering and the generative accounts of having worked with them. That has really infused my thinking in this area. So what I say today is I'm honoring the people I've had the privilege who've hosted me in their lives, and I carry that with me. And that's very important for me to name as I start in this cultural diversity here, with different genders and sexual orientations, I imagine, that are present, and different languages and experiences of migration. So, now how do I, oh. So my intent in this kind of 35 minutes or so remaining is hoping to give some space to gather our interest briefly through our bodies in a moment, and briefly to stay with the resonating and vibrations that get evoked for you as you hear me. Those are both similarities and things that you may counteract with a strong differentiation are really welcome. And as a one of maintaining a spaciousness and exploration of what moves through you as you hear me. Unfortunately, I can't see you, so I'm having to imagine your living, animating bodies as I'm present with you here. Then I will look at exile as a process, a phenomenological process that is of a organism environmental field, as opposed to an event. And looking at it then from a queer perspective, where it emerges of a fracturing field, where I'm going to hopefully present a perspective where I think this idea of hospitality of the Gestalt group practitioner is required to afford possibilities for renewing and the healing of exiling. And lastly, at the end, is going to offer a conceptual frame that's informed my practice over the last few years in working this terrain, particularly from a group perspective. I'll say more why group's important and why I'm holding that desire with a real intent in this presentation here today. It's very specific that I'm talking about group, and I hope that'll become clear as I progress. Inviting you, each of you, for a moment. Let's take a moment. And if you can come back to your embodied experiences in any way that makes sense, and it's an invitation to bring to mind a memory or a feeling or sensation of a time when you felt exiled or homeless in a group. A sort of feeling where home was not available to you, either in your family of origin, your country of origin, your groupings, your communities. I'm going to allow a minute for you just to notice what that evokes for you. I'm still present with you as I breathe into this experience, also remembering through my body and the vibrations here, for me, with this invitation. We're going to notice the movement of your body, the sensations and feelings and vibrations. And just take a moment. If you may want to just bring it to your cognitive part or jot it down or not, but just take a moment How are you sensing and feeling and moving in your whole body in this present moment, here and now, as we start in this situation here? And what were the field conditions for you in relationship to others at the time of this memory that was called forth? What were the cultural conditions? What were the socio-political conditions? What were the nature of the individuals you were in relationship with? And just a note, when this feeling of homelessness or feeling exiled or marginalized was evoked for you in the context of a group. So with that as ground, I'm inviting you to, if at all possible, state the vibrations of your bodily knowing, which is not just your cognitive knowing, as you attend to this time here in whatever way is possible for you. Exiling is personal to me. I'm a queer man. I'm a migrant. I live between countries of the island of Ireland and England. And I have worked with different groups who have migrated from different continents over 15, 20 years, many of whom which were LGBTQI, but not solely. So this is personal to me, but also personal to those that I'm living with in light of this dialogue here and this conversation I'm having. Even though you're not conversing with me, I'm present to that possibility. The distinct thing I would want to name is with the LGBTQI person is the loss of belonging may already be experienced in their country of origin. The exiling may already be experienced in the country of birth and their family of birth. It is not uncommon for queer individuals to feel not belonging to their original family group. So this is an ontological question for many LGBTQI persons, irrespective of culture. And yet there are distinctions, of course, in relationship to culture and race and ethnicity, etc. But there's also an ontological sense of being into a world which is primarily heteronormative, where the bodies are colonized with a heteronormative perspective. So from the very beginning of our thrownness into groups, the queer body, and I'll use that as a shorthand for LGBTQI in the essence of time, are already impregnated with a heterosexual, often patriarchal worldview that is inscribed upon our carnal experience. And that is sensed and felt even before we have a pre-reflective knowing. So my view here, of course, of this is shaped by my particular thrownness. I'm a white man. I carry privilege in this world. I identify as cisgender male. That also carries privilege for me. I'm queer. That carries certain privilege in certain groups and not in many others. I'm also originally of working class, even though I'm no longer working class. So I carry those histories with me, and that's going to shape, of course, my worldview, which I try to examine over time. But I want to be transparent around my seeing of the world around this phenomenon is shaped by my positionality within this person environmental field context. So I want to spend a bit of time just kind of looking at exiling from the broader literature and kind of give some sense of there are the multiplicity of meanings that are present here with the notion of exile. An exiled person leaves against their will with little time to prepare for departure as a sense of urgency where the trauma is aground, unlike the immigrant. So there are distinctions here between the exile who departs from a fractured ground of war, climate crisis, violence, and also possibly for the queer exile who's had to leave with a sense of urgency because their identities were at threat. In other words, there's an existential threat to who they were and their existence. And as Said says, exile is not a choice. It happens. It's something we're born, some people are born into by virtue of their sexuality and sometimes their gender. And they're exiled from the very beginning of their thrownness in the world by virtue of how they identify. For the exiled person, homeland is one with little affordance to return, while also they're denied the right of a farewell, which is a part of liminality, this part of transition that happens with the emigrant or the immigrant who has a choice to leave, where they can have the farewells, they can say the goodbyes. But for many of the LGBTQI experiences, not for all, but for many, particularly when the exile is present, is they were thrown out of their situation because to stay within it risks their very existence. And that contributes to the self's ability to recollect itself, because the sense of home was an unhoming, the state that they may have been born into, and I mean that a political state, a cultural state, a familial state, was not a state that held their existence of being at home. And that, I believe, contributes to the sense of a lack of a coherent verbal self around the experience of the migrant who moves across spaces. As the personality function is very discombobulated, disorientated. This is who I am. This is what the world says I am. That poses real disconnects and discombobulation around who am I within such situations. And also exile is seen as an existential migration to express something fundamental about one's personal existence by leaving one's homeland and becoming a foreigner. This is also a form of migration that one may be a little bit more privileged at times. And it's a form of self-chosen exile, where such exile is lived as a process of not belonging, maybe support for differentiating, to sense and feel oneself in relation with others. So I have clients like, and give them pseudonyms, Mercy from Uganda, who had to leave because the nature of her existence was threatened. There was no choice in it. And then I have a Billy like me, or the more familiar now in the last 20 years, who has a choice to leave. But even though the homeland may always be supportive, it was one where they could leave because it wasn't going to kill them. And I use this language purposefully because that's the existence of many people in some countries who belong to this group. So from a Gestalt hermeneutic phenomenological perspective, I want to also identify what exile is not. So this is what some of the literature said what it is, what it points towards, with a kind of taking a kind of a queer lens on it. But I also want to highlight what it's actually not, in my view. Exile is not the interpsychic parts of oneself often employed in things like internal family systems, parts of myself that are disowned, exiled from my awareness. That's not what I'm talking about here. It's also not what can occur occasionally in some perspectives of Gestalt therapy, but less so. There's one person's psychology perspective that omits to retain our unitary organism field perspective as a starting situation. In other words, exile is not just in the person. From my perspective, exile is of a field, is of a situation. It's not down to the individual to address the exile experience, which is a one-person psychology view. And exile in my situation here, as I'm discussing, is not the one of a more privileged stance, which can be used as a metaphor at times of taking a place of marginalization that enables one to critically discern who I am and what I am in the world. It has its function. I think artists do this quite well, which has its place, but I'm not talking about that nature of exile. I'm referring to the more ontological experience of exiling as lived with one's thrownness into the world when born in a heteronormative situation. And lastly, it's not an event, an extrinsic diagnosis, a generalized category, or a noun. So that's just to clarify what it's not for me. Exiling is, phenology of exiling is a process. It's not an event. It has a directionality of a moving away from what was familiar and painful, and a moving towards what has yet to become known. Exiling emerges from a shuddering of community and group lives and provokes a fracturing of relational connections which evoke pain and suffering. These field attributes contribute to a phenomenon of exiling in our therapy and supervision groups. It's seeking to be transformed by tending to the ruptures of the social relational bond in groups, because it's in groups does it first occur. Hence, it's in groups that it can be potentially repaired, renewed, and healed. So I'm making an intentional advocacy for attending to the nature of exiling within this particular LGBTQI community, within group. That's where the fracturing first appears and is first lived with in one's family of origin. And this is incredibly painful, even as I say it through me. I can feel the pain of my own experience vibrating through me and the welling of tears that I have to press into the ground to go, I need to find my support. So it's that visceral for me still, even after all these years of being out as a queer person since I've been 20. It's that alive still. And I know that's the case for many of my clients, and maybe has resonance for some people here. Exiling, because it's ontological, I hold a view, is an existential crisis, not necessarily a traumatizing experience for the LGBTQI person. For these reasons, where home was already a place of exile. It was not necessarily a place of belonging, nor was it a place that one could feel one's safety and one's sense of cohering self of who I am and how I can exist in the world to be held with a gaze of delight. The presence of the exiled queer person changes a community also and disrupts perceived cohesion of a particular community that evokes visceral responses. Those visceral responses are often not because of what one says, but maybe one's orientation and how they move at a kinesthetic level through the world that others vibrate with, which can evoke a sense of attack, a dismissal, the shaming, the not confirming of oneself that may not happen explicitly even with verbs or language, but is held by the absence of the gaze, the absence of the invite, the looking away, the exclusion, the omission. For the exiled queer person, there's also an ongoing sense of wandering. There's a dislocation. I'm wandering in the world with a sense of confusion. And that's many of my clients who arrive from different countries of origin are wandering this new land with a sense of confusion and a sense of wonder. There is this kind of sense of, my hand here moves out, like to reach into the world with a sense of possibility in the hope that I maybe feel myself and be reconfirmed in a way that I had not experienced in my country of origin or in my family of origin. And these are daily occurrences and daily encounters. And hence, I think such an experience is a crisis of the id functioning. It's not a crisis of the personality functioning. It's a crisis very much of that thrownness in the world where our sense of rootedness is already altered in life. So I kind of argue that exiling persons of the queer persons are threshold people. We're living and selfing this liminal space where we're moving between spaces, where the beginning of beginnings and unexpected occurrences intertwine to give form to new possibilities of contacting only and if affordance of the supports become available. I'll repeat that. These are threshold individuals in this liminal space where the past is present, and the now for next is only form and forming. They're moving in this space, which is the beginning of something, but there's unexpected occurrences that are interpenetrating these that may offer new possibilities for contacting when the affordance of supports become available. And that affordance of supports, I argue, is an ethical responsibility for the Gestalt group therapist. So exiling is experienced and met from a sensible world through the aesthetics of contacting, not necessarily from our cognitive knowing. Yes, our cognitive knowing has a function, it supports us, but I'm inviting us to hold the possibility of this embodied knowing through the aesthetics of contacting, through our senses and the kinesthesia, the feel of ourselves in movement. It's a whole bodily experience with bidirectionality. It's a moving, as I said earlier, from way what's familiar to moving towards what is yet to become known and revealed to us. And it's an ongoing experience of the queer living body in a heteronormative world, in a heteronormative field. For the queer person, it's inescapable, because the exiling experience is one of the first experience they have from once they're born into a world, which may not have formed this aspect of their identity, which is very different from somebody who may be heteronormative. And there's subtle differences. It's not to say heteronormative people don't experience it, but there are subtle differences. So this exiling of is a live body process experienced through the soma, which is what I mean, the carnal, the fleshy, the visceral nature of us, and the aesthetics of contacting, which is through our senses. And my argument is to really pay attention to these movement by movement and moment to moment in the encounter with each other as we work as group practitioners with members of groups. And it emerges at the contact boundary. So some of my thinking, and kind of to honor this, and this has been informed by kind of Merleau-Ponty's work, where he talks about our bodies are intertwined with the world. We're made of the same sensible stuff of the world that we're embedded in, and we're resonating with the world. In other words, as I move through the world moves through me, but we're constantly in motion in relation with another, where our revelation of who we are is also made possible by those who are moving with us in the context of groups. And when I talk about movement, I'm talking of the kinesthesia of movement, the feel of our moving bodies that may not even be visible in a gesture. It's that inter-embodied vibration that is present and available for us as Gestalt group practitioners that some other modalities don't have as available. To build that early developmental ground of having a presence of, I receive you, I welcome you, even though that may not need to be said with words. So this queer exiling fracturing field is a suffering field. So one of the things I'm starting to think and move on to in the time I have is, how do we foster kind of a embodied presence as group practitioners and not perpetuate or amplify the lived experience of absence and possible homelessness that may contribute to the psychopathological field of suffering for members in groups. So the individual and groups are intertwined, and we have an ethical responsibility to transmute the high intensity of this unassimilated effect that requires an embodied quality of presence of the group practitioner that is a part of what I call these affordances, that afford a restorative possibility to be made available for members of a group who identify as queer. There's also this stance of hospitality. Irrespective of the group practitioner's identity, and I mean gender, sexual orientation, sexual identity, etc., we need to cultivate a stance of hospitality. This is critical in the sense of that it's an ethical responsibility, that the face of the other implicitly demands on me to take an active interest in the well-being of this other who is suffering, emerging from a field that is fractured, where they're living with the existence of exiling that is of their group origin and is alive for them and being relived in the group as we work with them. And that requires not just words, but concrete acts. Hence, the concrete acts for me are the acts of the group practitioner paying attention to their embodied experiences that may begin to afford a group field that may lend new supports for contacting of confirmation, of acceptance, of warmth, as Larissa was saying, of compassion, but are felt and held through the gaze as well as the vibrating of the body. Turning towards the suffering other, the whole body of the other, who calls on us to be with the attendant suffering and motion towards an unknown solution. Because we don't know what the solution is, as I'm with my other group members. But I trust by this attendance of an embodied present through the kinesthesia of paying attention to the id functioning of the group, that this offers the grounds of contacting and of excitement and novelty. This is a demand on the group practitioner, irrespective of the group practitioner's sexual orientation or sexual identity. Is that we have the privilege, even as a queer therapist, I have the privilege of locating myself from a place of safety. As many who have migrated and lived the experience of exile do not live with that as a part of their existence. They emerge from a ground of living with an existential threat that is alive and vibrating in them. So I, even as the queer therapist, and also those of you that are heterosexual or bisexual, we have an ethical responsibility to cultivate possibilities of supporting the sensations and affect and feelings that is substrate of human emotions, to restore faith that this background in this group affords support for the now, for next, in the here and now, which is this idea of this liminal space, this idea of this boundary phenomenon, this idea of this threshold experience. So I'm drawn sometimes to poetic form as a way of trying to find my way in to another way into kind of conveying this experience. This is a poem by an Irish philosopher and poet called John O'Donoghue. I'll read it in English, and that may enable others to translate into the other languages, and it may, of course, not translate easily to the native language. But what I'm intending in this is a kind of, it illuminates a sense of hospitality within a heteronormative world. So he says, may my body come alive today to the invisible geography that invites me to new frontiers, to break the dead shell of yesterdays, to risk being disturbed and changed. So if I just break that down briefly as a kind of a lens into what I'm talking about, working with groups within the phenomenon of the exiled experience of the queer individual who's living an existential experience of exile where they did not belong in their country of origin, is the Gestalt, as a Gestalt therapist, in the sense of hospitality, I have an ethical responsibility to enliven my bodily experience in the presence of this new landscape, this new geography that is unknown to me. Even as a queer person, I do not know the experience of this other queer person. It's an invisible geography to me, their world. I need to be open it and with my body to meet them at their frontier, at their threshold, at their liminal experience. To be open to discarding my ideas, my personality function of my idea of what it is to be queer in the world, or what it is to be in a world where I live with exile. And to be open to the possibility of meeting them at their frontier and to risk being disturbed, for I to be risked to feel the sense of being exiled and to be altered and changed. This is a considerable, I believe, and in my own experience, this is a considerable ethical call on the group practitioner to be irrevocably changed and altered in some way as a way of supporting the exiling experience with working with the queer community. And that includes me as a queer person. It makes demands, and self-care is required. So what I'll offer before I close is very simply a conceptual frame that may support an orientation in working with groups in particular, but groups working with through the lived bodily experience that I've found a support to me over time in working with this exile experience of queer identities who arrive from places where they were born into, where the very essence of who they were was not confirmed, which is very unlike from any other child who's born into a family of origin. And hence I go back and say it's an existential crisis, it's an ontological crisis that continues throughout one's life as a queer person. So there's three phases that enables the practitioner to hang out really in the id functioning of this world, this place of betwixt and between, this place of liminality. Just conceptually, just place it up here. I'll go into these in a little bit more detail before I close this briefly. But we exist in a world that has different movements, there are different pressures, different vibrations of this phenomenological world that we live in. And we carry our histories of our culture, our gender, our socio-political status, the experience of war or not, the experience of being received or not. These are part of the world that we arrive with through our lived body within a group. And each member carries this unique geography, this unique bodily scape, this unique kinesthetic world that's alive to them that may not even be known reflectively. And as the group therapist, we have a responsibility to dwell, to hang out with this, to be with it. And then the next is kind of, how are we being informed and shaped by it? How is this forming me through this world of, through my bodily knowing, and really holding in abeyance or holding to one side the cognitive knowing so as not to prematurely make meaning. So stay with this frontier land, this land that is yes to be known to me by these unique individuals who are with me in this group, who have lived in a group where it hasn't been held. And then how can that be transformed? Not for me, but how do we create the conditions in this group for a new experience to be possibly tasted, to be smelt in the tiniest of movements that may support a updating of the personality function over time. And I mean that over time. It's an iterative process over time and again and again. Because this is also a developmental journey. So lastly, just to put some context onto some of this, what I mean by these, just briefly, aware of time here. Dwelling, so this approach what I call carnal hermeneutics. What I briefly mean is it's paying attention to the lived bodily as a group therapist with other members in a group. These three phases are not linear, just to be clear, they're there all the time. One's more foreground, the others are background. There's that kind of dance of foreground and background. And they used the invitation to come to them as orientations. So dwelling is a form of lingering with the present experience, or being in touch with being in the world that supports a hospitality towards otherness, towards difference, to hold a sense of in awe of this presencing that is now being lived with me. It's where the past is alive, the ghostly past of our experience, but also as the group practitioner, but also other members of the group. There's an ache for it to be called forward in the hope that new experiences, new ways of being seen may be actually made possible. So that's kind of it's the hanging out. Informing is the place of where we're beginning to explore the intentionality of contacting, which is both taking form and being giving form in the reciprocal encounter between members in the group. This often happens through the gaze, through the vibrations, through the nods, through the words that are said, through the resonances of similar experiences. What's being called forth here? What's the intentionality of the contacting that's happening between group members? And what's being called forth of you or I as the group practitioner that may lend and support the now for next, which is this kind of transforming possibility where it's this kind of sense of crossing over to the other side of the moon. It's this sense of, can I momentarily, and I think it's, for me, it's different than the act of inclusion. Am I willing to cross this metaphorical contact boundary, to live and to feel it? The difference being is I may need to give up my own experience of myself and to being transformed in it as I arrive back from the world of inhabiting this person's world and re-inhabit my own to see what's now possible in this exile context. So that's just a kind of a very kind of conceptual way of holding in mind these three different kind of aspects of working within a group. It's a kind of conceptual orientation I'm offering. Conscious of time, so I'm just going to thank you for bearing with me into this world that is a heteronormative world, but a queer perspective within a heteronormative world. It's a place that like this, that you've created in this conference, that it offers me hope in the sense of I was invited, other people are here. That is the beginning of something. That gives me hope as I continue in this work of social justice, which I know is instrumental to many of us are here today, and probably why many of you are here today at this time of a fracturing world where war is in existence and there's injustice. It is beyond just sexuality, but in many ways. So I thank you for listening to me and bearing with me as a queer Irishman who is a migrant and who continues to move. And I have the privilege of moving, which many of my clients don't.
Thank you so much.
Dziękuję bardzo, Billy. Chciałabym i od siebie.
Thank you, Billy, and both from Aldona and on my behalf, I'd like to say I strongly felt this poem in all of my body. I see that there are other comments as well, stressing very much this bodily experience that has stayed with me as well after your presentation. So thank you very much for that. I would like to, I don't know if there are any other questions, more words of gratitude for you, Billy, but I'd like to offer a 10-minute break. So in order to take care of our interpreters who need a short break and maybe a sip of water. So 10 minutes break. But before we do that, let me just make sure there are no other questions or comments.
Carolina, it seems like 5 minutes left. For the break.
Okej. Panelistki Dominika Pliszecka.
Dominika and Pliszecka and Gosia Zinker are ready, and they can wait a bit longer for their presentation so that we can give the 10-minute break, which is needed. Billy, I see that there's a request to you. Could you please recommend some literature?
Yeah, of course. I will get some literature to you, to the conveners, Carolina, Elena, and John, and make sure you get some literature. Absolutely.
Deirdre's got her hand up in the chat. I don't know if there's anything you want. Sorry, Deirdre, I don't know if there's anything you want to come forward with. Is it possible to allow Deirdre to speak to people, or is that?
It's not possible because of technical. It's a webinar. So Deidre, you can write in the chat.
Okej, może zróbmy tak, że
Okay, in that case, let's start with our brief break. You can continue writing in the chat box if you wish. Billy, is it possible for you to stay for a bit longer with us?
Yeah, of course.
Okej.
Thank you, Billy. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, John. Thank you. Thank you for your very warm and I've got the word, supportive holding, John, as I arrived on. Thank you. Really supportive. I get anxious around these things, so thank you for that, John. Really supported me. I felt very supported by you.
Yeah. So what you share what you presented means a lot to me as a fellow queer person, and as others have said in the chat, I can feel. I'm not sure if it's quite as discernible as a vibration, but there is movement. There's movement within me. It gives language, or it's language that talks to something of my experience of having exile within my ground. Very powerful.
Yeah. I have more thinking to do around this, John, I think, as I more think about it. I'm just wondering, John, do you want me? I'm happy to hang on, but what's your sense? I'll hang on for until the break's over if you need. I'm fine with that.
It's up to you, Billy. My sense is it's a bit hard to gauge because we have this slightly disembodied relationship with people who are here. But the comments seem to have stopped, so my sense is that you're welcome to leave if you want to. Otherwise, we can take a sort of 5 minutes probably.
Yeah, we'll take a break, John. I'll hang around for about 10. I've got a 12 o'clock, so I'm just going to venture off by then. I'll just hang around just in case. Yeah, so I'll be right back.
Okay.
Okay. If I don't see you or speak to you again, thank you so much to you and Lena and to Carolina, but particularly to you and Lena because I've had more contact. Yeah, I really hope the rest of the conference goes really well, John.
Thank you, Billy.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah.
All right.
So go well, John. I'm lovely to hear your voice and see you in this way as well.
Likewise.
Yeah. Bye bye.
Rest today as well.
Yeah, I will. Bye
Bye.
bye.